Yes, I have been here a number of times to do things with HMA and the university and the Bishop Museum, and I'm very pleased about that. This will make my 6th trip in the last few years. But if you'll indulge me a personal note, the very first time I came to Hawaii was many years ago, and that was to celebrate my marriage. And that wedding took place overlooking the Pacific Ocean in far distant San Francisco, exactly 27 years ago this afternoon. Thank you. So we have 27 legal years and 32 actual years, and my husband is at home with the teenager who has a concert this afternoon. So I will celebrate with you, and I appreciate your being here. So in my practice, I am a practitioner. I am not an academic, and I am not a capital R researcher. Certainly visitor studies and our understanding of museology benefits from all 3 of those types of information coming in. Like you, I spend my life buried in deadlines and budgets and report writing. And once in a while, it's nice to lift my head out of that and come to a meeting and be inspired by what my colleagues are working on. And what I want to do today is inspire you with the confidence to go back to your institutions and start or maybe increase or somehow augment your efforts at bringing the visitor to the fore, bringing the visitor voice into your process as much as possible. And I will hope to do that by sharing with you lots of information and quite a few tools. I'm sorry, this thing turned off again. There we go. There's oceans of research out there. There's a lot that we know, and there are a lot of tools out there. And I will be sharing with you many resources, also some basic information about what we know about visitors, and I'll especially be looking at things I think that you can handle in-house pretty easily. Increasingly, I'm called upon to come into institutions for professional development workshops to help them increase their internal capacity for visitor studies. So it's my nature to be workshoppy, and that's not what we can do in 30 minutes. So I'm going to be skating across the surface of a lot of things, but don't worry about taking notes. I have tools for you. This PowerPoint, in fact, is one of the tools I want to send home with you. I'm going to tweak it a little bit before it goes. But usually I only use pictures, and my slideshows are really pretty, but I won't be accused of that here and now. I have a lot of text on some of these slides, so that my thinking is that you can take it back, share it with your colleagues as you try to ramp up for more visitor studies. Included in the text are lots of references that are cited and with links. So even if the link isn't live in whatever version you got, you can copy and paste it and find these many resources. The citation format might be a little idiosyncratic, so please be generous, the academics among you. Another tool is a very cool thing I'm really happy to share. It just went live, that Visitor Studies Manual, wordpress.com. That was actually one of the deliverables from one of those professional development projects I did. That was done with the San Luis Obispo Museum of Art on the Central Coast of California. And the executive director, Karen Kyle, has generously let us put that on a public setting. So you can't find it by Googling it, but you can find it with that exact address. Much of what I'm going to talk about today you can find there in greater detail, including mechanics of how to design surveys and stuff like that we can't get into this morning. Things on the slideshow that are referenced specifically in that blog are marked with an asterisk on the slideshow. So hopefully those will be a good companion to my talk, which will introduce you to the range of things that are there. All right. So I want to start a moment with some terms. I think of the term visitor studies as an umbrella term that includes audience research, noting that the audiences who we're aiming for, the visitors, are the ones that are showing up. So that umbrella covers audience research, motivation studies, evaluation, which is where we're looking at impacts and how to generate them, satisfaction studies, and I think there's a lot of self-assessment that can go under that umbrella as well. Visitor studies tends to be research with a lowercase r. It's very site-specific, and it's not intended to generate big generalizable findings. That would be capital R research, and we do definitely benefit from that in our understanding of visitors. But those are really big, hefty studies, often university-based or at places like the Exploratorium. And I'll refer to some of those as well. I use that term interchangeably. I also want to talk about the term surveys. I refer to them frequently. I think of surveys as either a self-completed instrument where the respondent writes the answers, and that would be a questionnaire form typically. Surveys can also be done as an interview style, wherein the interviewer is using a structured talk, a structured interview with preset questions on a questionnaire form. It's like an oral version of the questionnaire form. Then you move into open-ended interviews and group interviews, both of which take a little bit more skill, and depending on how fancy or tricky your material is, those can be done in-house or you might need outside help. So I'll be touching more on that. And what is the point of visitor studies anyway? As with any research, lowercase or capital R, research, we're doing these things to answer questions. And in our case, we're answering questions about how can we best meet our mission by providing quality experiences for visitors. When we do provide quality experience for visitors, you know that upward spiral that begins. They have a good time, they have repeat visits, they give us good word of mouth, they become members, they become donors. We all know that. Another huge benefit of visitor studies is that it gives you fodder to make your grant requests much more powerful. If you can document successes or say, we've talked to our visitors and we know they're going to take advantage of X project that we want you to fund. It makes your argument much stronger. All right, so I'm sorry, I must be talking too long. That keeps going to sleep. All right, so first of all, why do visitors come in the first place? There are several researchers that are really focused on this. Zahava Deering is at the Smithsonian. Packer and Valentine work together. They're based in Australia. And then I think you probably all know about John Falk, and some of you did my workshop when we talked about his identity tool. They all have talked with visitors at a variety of places and arrived at very similar conclusions about what influences people to come to museums. So for instance, Deering at the Smithsonian identified 4 what she calls satisfying experiences: social experiences, object, cognitive, and introspective. And you'll hear these reflected in Packer and Valentine's work, where they identified 5 that they describe as learning and discovery, passive enjoyment, restoration, social interaction, and self-fulfillment. So you see they map together pretty well. It tells us that these are valid findings. John Falk used a little bit different approach. He went back over decades of work and reread hundreds of interviews with this question of motivation in mind and came out with another similar range of things, but he describes them more from the perspective of the identity that the person holds when they choose to make that trip. So for instance, the 5 main ones are explorer. That's a person who's just always excited about finding new information. The facilitator, who's there on behalf of somebody else. The mommy who wants a good experience for the child, or the good host who has a visitor from out of town, that kind of thing. The experience seeker is a collector of experiences. So of course, when you're in Honolulu, what do? You get your picture taken in front of the palace. It's just what one does. Their visit wouldn't be complete without that. The professional hobbyist is someone who has a deep connection to the content. So anyone in this room would be the museology professional hobbyist. So at least during some part of any museum visit, I bet you're wearing that hat. And then the rechargers, which is like that introspection thing that we heard, and restoration that we heard from the other researchers. He has also later added 2 others, identities that are very rare in most places, and that is respectful pilgrim, which of course is exemplified by what happens at Pearl Harbor for many people, and affinity seekers, which is more typical of like a culturally specific museum. So if we, all right, this goes off every time. If we know these things about what makes visitors come out, what can we do? What can you do at your institutions? I really recommend John Falk's card sort activity, and I have it with me, but I don't have it here at the podium. he has, for each of those 5 identities, one card, and that card has 4 images. Here's one. And in order to do this study, it's very simple and very quick, which makes it fun too. When you're doing a motivation study of any kind, whether you've devised your own survey or you're using John's tool, you need to get people right when they're arriving. If they've experienced something, then it might cloud their thinking about why it was they wanted to come in the first place. So you greet them right at the entry. You ask them nicely, won't you take a moment and let us know a little bit about why you chose to come today. And then they pick one of the 5 pages that best describes why they came today. And you're done. So very nice and quick, less than a minute. This is a kind of study where you can learn how do people perceive your institution, why do they seek you out, what do they expect of you when they get there. And you can think about how well that matches what you thought you were projecting and offering. Now, I never want to overburden the respondent, but once you have them, it's kind of hard to let them go with just one question. So I would let you add a couple small items to that opportunity at an entry study. If you could add 2 or 3 of those items, inform yourselves with other valuable information, that's great. But remember, you caught them at the entry, so keep it really short. I would say under 2 minutes. Okie doke, so they've motivated to come see you, and they've arrived. What do we know about what they need in order to get started, and why is that important? Here is a place where I think you will find you know a lot more about visitors than you realized, or maybe than you realized was really relevant and important. And by the way, I don't mind being a master of the obvious occasionally. So we know from our friend Maslow that everyone has a subconscious drive to confirm that they're in a safe place. Their biology has to be taken care of before they can take in anything heady. An interpretive ranger once told me, first they pee, then they see. So it's crude, but it's really, really accurate. If we haven't assured them that their biology is okay, they can't take in our message. We also learned a lot about creature comforts from the retail world. And the book cited there for you is by Paco Underhill. It's called Why We Buy. And he has a lot of examples about people's behavior he has seen in the retail world that carry over to our world and that stem from Maslow's work. So for instance, there's a transition zone when a person comes into a new space where they're subconsciously transitioning into the space and checking it out and making sure it's okay. If they're drawn past your orientation material for the exhibition or your entry by that transitioning, then they will have missed your setup for them in the orientation. I like to think of this entry as one of the phases of the visit, and Stephanie Weaver, who a lot of you know from some of those previous workshops, has done a terrific job of sort of dissecting the exhibit into different phases, and she's got wonderful work about this process of inviting and welcoming and orienting. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Special needs populations is one of the things I want to put on your radar. Any of these topics we could take a day workshop on. I'm happy to talk with you more about that if you like, but I definitely want to put it on your radar. It's an increasing interest and a powerful audience. So now that we know they have these needs when they reach us, what can you do? I do recommend Stephanie's self-assessment process to try to look at your place through the eyes of a visitor. It's easy to do an observation study. With any of these things, when we do a study, we're trying to elevate ourselves away from just anecdotal evidence. So you're doing an organized and systematic way of collecting information, just like you would in any research. So in an organized way, you can watch people as they're passing through whatever entry things you've got, from the parking lot to the door, or through, can they figure out where to buy a ticket when they come into the gift shop or whatever. And you might combine these kinds of things with a short intercept interview. It may not be at the entry. You might have a complicated campus or a building where there are transition points. Again, you can observe people there. If they seem lost, offer to help them and then ask them, if I weren't here to help you, what do you think the museum could have in place, and start thinking about how to support their Maslow needs. Alrighty. Okay, and so what you can learn is pretty obvious, but why is this important? I always tell clients that I'm happy to make visitors work and struggle, but I want them to work and struggle with our content and maybe with their conscience. I don't want them to waste energy figuring out what our content is or how to access it. So the easier we can make this transitioning into the experience for them, the more energy they can bring to the work we want them to do. Okie doke. Alrighty, so the visitors are there, they made it. They somehow made it through the parking lot and the entryway and got their tickets, and now they're in the gallery. What do they need from us to support engagement and learning? Indeed, to answer that question, we need to step back in time. And even before you start with your front-end evaluation, you need to have your conceptual ducks in a row. You know about big ideas and why they're helpful to the team and why they're helpful to the visitor. What I want to add to your thinking is, while you are pondering and refining your big idea, have the team take a summative approach and ask themselves, how do I want future visitors to perceive this? It's a nice clarifying exercise. I just wanted to put that in your toolkit. When you do have a good sense of what your big idea is, then you can move into front-end evaluation and later formative. I like to introduce these two together because even though they have distinctive purpose, they blend very naturally in real life. Hopefully you're using an iterative process. You don't have to do giant studies, you can do small studies, but go back to the floor as your questions evolve during your development process. So basically, front-end evaluation is an attempt to get into the head of the visitor and find out what is their personal narrative. Formative evaluation is, okay, we understand how they relate to this topic or this message, so are we doing a good job at meeting them where they are? And so we typically think of that as testing prototypes. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one. There are researchers and practitioners out there that have done fairly substantial work on getting into the minds of the public and finding out what their personal narratives are about big issues like you see listed here. This is not an exhaustive list, and it may be that some of you are wrestling with some kind of big topic. Talk with me later, maybe I know of something I can point you to. So when you start, it's always nice to check and see in the literature, has anybody else talked with the public about this and what are they finding and how might that inform my process? I'm so sorry here. Okay. All right, so what can you do after you've done your lit review? What can you do in-house? I do think that front end tends to be pretty tricky and challenging. If you're dealing with something that's potentially contentious or very confusing or quite heady, you might want to bring in some outside help to help design your study. But there's a lot you can do to expand your thinking. So those first two items, docent cart conversations and talkback stations, either with prompts or with objects and prompts, these are informal. You're not controlling the sampling. It's not a scientific study, but it's a really easy way to expand your understanding of what's going on in the heads of visitors. And it may be a really good step to inform the next iteration of your front-end evaluation. So you might really be on a fishing expedition, don't know what to expect, educate yourself a little bit with the informal version, and that will help you develop a survey. One of the reasons front end is hard for people to talk to you about is that you're asking them about something that doesn't exist yet. And people tend to live in a concrete world. So if you can use props, that's very helpful. Card sorts are a really simple thing to set up. That John Falk tool is a card sort of types where they sort through and select one. but you can design them to answer a lot of different questions. So for instance, years ago at Chabot Space and Science Center, when we were gearing up for an exhibit relating to climate change, we had cards with a variety of activities of what you can do to help with this issue. And there's a huge range, like recycling, taking the bus, buying a Prius, never flying again, what have you. And then we had them sort there are other reasons not to fly, but we had them sort into piles of, I already do this, oh, I could maybe do this, and that's completely unrealistic. So you can design these studies to meet your need. And just a note, by the way, recycling doesn't have a whole lot to do with climate change. I mean, you can draw the line, but it's subtle. It's not one of the biggest impacts. But by giving the visitor the option of that really easy thing, even though we know it's not that relevant, they don't have to feel guilty that they haven't done the other things. We don't want to hurt their feelings. We want them to come back. Let's see. Again, with the individual and group interviews, if you're dealing with something that's very straightforward, easy to handle in-house, if things are getting more sophisticated, you might want some advice from outside. One of the best, easiest group interview kinds of things to do is with teachers. If you bring teachers on board to help you brainstorm perhaps about programmatic things that associate with the exhibit, or what features in the exhibit would support them in a field trip. Teachers are fabulous. They are natural collaborators. They're eager to share their ideas. They love working together. And for that kind of brainstorming activity, I think that's easy to handle in-house. But if you are dealing with content that's very heady or possibly contentious, you're going to want an experienced person controlling the dynamic of a group interview. Okie doke. So, I must be talking too long. As I said, the whole point of front end is to try and get a grip on people's personal narrative. The one thing on this slide that I want to call out is that idea of preferences or interest level. If you're asking people about things that are unfamiliar to them, they may not have enough information to accurately tell you whether or not they would find that interesting or would prefer it. This is an area where you want to tread carefully, and Randy Korn has a great article about that, which is listed in the articles I've got for you. So many people and many efforts and many years of research in formative and summative and other kinds of studies has generated a body of work that tell us about visitor behavior and how to design for visitors. This, again, is not an exhaustive list. There are loads of people with website or blogs as well as publications. You can go study those on your own. There will not be a test at the end of the hour. But I want to just go over a few of the basic things that we know about visitors, and I'm sure a lot of these will be familiar to you. First of all, we know that people have different learning styles. Thank you, Howard Gardner. We know that generally speaking, and all of these I'm painting with a big brush, but they're not without use. Generally, people don't look up. Generally, visitors can easily get drawn by a large, attractive landmark. They tend to drift out the first exit that they see from the exhibition space. There's a right-hand turn bias, which in my experience isn't super strong. You can, oh goodness, you can design around that pretty easily. We've got this issue of the transition zone. We know people always want more seating. We know they will basically not attend to the videos in your exhibition if there is no seating. They want large font size. They generally don't read long labels if they read labels at all. If they initiate contact with an interactive, it's very likely to be based on what they saw the previous person doing. If they do take in the directions or instructions for the interactive, and you don't have content embedded in there in little chunks, and the content is over here, they're very likely to miss the content. We know that if an interactive is slow to respond, people will assume it's broken. Or if there's nothing, say, I'm thinking, it's, I'm not broken. We know that they need an appropriate level of challenge to feel success. We know that parents are anxious about looking ignorant in front of their children, so when we design but that's not true of people in this room, is it? We're beyond that. It's okay not to know everything. I certainly don't, and I don't want to. But when we have interactives or some kind of activity for adults and children, you might need to provide support for the adult so they can facilitate for the child and feel confident. We also know that their attention is fleeting. In a formal tracking and timing study, a 3-second stop counts as a stop to attend to something. Yeah. Alrighty, so as I mentioned, prototype testing is typically what we think of for formative testing. When you build a prototype, please make it kind of scruffy. If it looks too finished, you haven't given the visitor permission to critique it or tell you what they don't like about it. You can invite people to interact with your prototype and watch them, ask them to narrate what's happening for them, or just talk to them about it when they finish. In a more naturalistic setting, you can just let people approach on their own and then approach them and talk to them about their experience of it. And this isn't just for interactives. You can do this for any kind of case or object or text or graphics. When it comes to text, you might be testing for voice and vocabulary. In that kind of test, you give a person a printed copy to read, always read out loud with them until they dismiss you and tell you you don't need to read out loud for them. And then after they paraphrase it for you, you can ask things like, do you think there are any words in there that would be hard for people? Take the onus off the respondent. Again, we don't want to hurt their feelings. We want them to come back and feel good. Okie doke. So clearly you're learning about the effectiveness of your interactives and your messaging. I want to call attention to that bottom line. You might learn something that your front end did not tell you. For that same climate change exhibit at Chabot in the Oakland Hills, we were testing a big kind of complicated interactive about biofuels and came to understand that, and we were talking to family members of the Science Museum, and there were many adults that didn't fully understand the carbon cycle. So if you don't understand the carbon cycle, global warming and the possible assistance of biofuels is really hard to latch onto. So you just can't over-test. There's a terrific developer at Thanksgiving Point in Salt Lake City, just outside Salt Lake, that I heard speak at the WMA conference last fall, who said, if you're not prototyping, yeah, you are prototyping, but you're doing it with your fabricated works on the floor with visitors. And it's a way to save a ton of money on remediation if you can do some good testing. All right, so they made it to our place. They somehow navigated the entry. They've been enjoying our exhibits. How can we really know what impact we're having? By the way, that was an exhibit that was designed to create cognitive dissonance in visitors at the Exploratorium, and I think it worked really well. So this is where we move into the realm of summative evaluation. If you've got money for remediation, then you can do a remedial evaluation, and that would be swell, although it's not very common. The tools are very similar for both. Usually a summative study includes an observation study of some sort and also an exit survey of some sort. We sometimes do pre and post tests with visitors, but that's a lot more complicated. I would never recommend that in-house. Similarly, a full tracking and timing study where we have a map and we follow people and note their behaviors and times, very tedious. You have to be meticulous. I would never recommend that in-house either. But there's a different kind of observational study called behavioral mapping, where you pass through the gallery again, we're being organized, not anecdotal, so every 30 minutes, say, for a couple days. And on a map of the exhibition, you mark wherever there's a person. And you build up an understanding of what the hotspots are, what might be getting overlooked, and this might indicate to you that a targeted observation study is necessary. So you might be watching, well, how come it is that at this point people seem not to go over here? Then you can do a targeted observation without burdening yourself with an entire tracking and timing. Oh, and one more point on the exit survey. Beverly Sorrell has a really nicely crafted one that was designed to be self-completed by the respondent, very easy to administer at the exit. If you want to get reliable dwell time, you cue them at the entrance and say, welcome to the exhibition. When you're done, won't you come do our survey? And of course they will say yes, or mostly they will say yes, because people are nice and helpful. And when they come back, when they agree, then you hand them a little card on which you've jotted their entry time. When they come to get the survey, you collect that card, jot down their exit time, and you've got reliable dwell time. people are really bad at self-reporting dwell time. So this is one of the only ways, that or full tracking and timing. Self-assessment, super valuable. Again, Beverly has a terrifically developed tool called the Framework for Judging Exhibition Excellence Through the Perspective of the Visitor, or something snappy like that. And it's a wonderful exercise to do. You can have a little team of your own staff or a team from maybe a few people from different institutions around town and go every quarter or every month and make a little field trip and use that tool as you look at an exhibition. It's fun, and it keys you in and gets you used to thinking about things from the visitor perspective and increases your vocabulary about how to talk about that and what's out there. So highly recommended. And so summative studies tell you patterns of use, as I mentioned, dwell time. When it comes to impacts, there's another thing we could spend a day on. And I'm going to update this slide for you before we send it home. NSF and the NRC have done a lot of work on expanding our thinking about those things in a way that's very helpful. So I'm going to add that for you before we send this out. What I've been talking about prior to this has been what we call casual visitors, people that arrive without an externally mandated mission. Field trip students clearly arrive with an externally mandated mission. So we do evaluate them, but we treat them completely separately. Okay. Here's some very good, mostly recent research on field trips, how to support them. I recommend all of those articles. I'm a little low on time, so I won't discuss them in any detail right now. Clearly, these are the kinds of things you can learn from field trip programs, evaluations. And I'm really sorry about this. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but IRB is coming. And for some of us, it's already here. IRBs are institutional review boards, and they exist to oversee research to protect human research subjects. Technically, if you're working with federal money, technically you're supposed to submit your protocol to an IRB for approval. It may be that it's exempt from oversight. It may be that it requires oversight. But it's not you, the citizen, who gets to decide. It's the board. Now, functionally, this hasn't really got us by the throat yet unless you're dealing with NSF money or NASA money. IMLS isn't requiring it yet, but I think that's coming. And I don't know about NEH. I would ask Stacy if that's on their radar. Not yet. I just want you to be aware that it exists. You need to build in extra time and money for it. I'm happy to talk to you in more detail. I'm still learning the ropes myself because it hasn't been something I've had to deal with very much until now, till last year or so. Things you can learn. Whoops. And I wanted to have a note for you about satisfaction studies. This top tool comes to us from the corporate world, the Net Promoter Score, not without controversy, as most things. I think it's most effective when it's used iteratively. So for instance, I know they use this at the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago, before and after they make changes on the floor. They are dealing with thousands of visitors a day, so they can rack up a lot of data. In most cases, I think a better satisfaction tool approach is something like this question on the bottom. In either case, just a score or a rating isn't very informative if you don't ask them why they scored it that way. That's where you really learn what's happening. I like the satisfaction studies because you can direct them either at a single part of the experience or at the institution overall. And there's a way you can start to break down the management silos. Because broadly, satisfaction with the whole visit is everybody's responsibility, not just education and exhibits. So I hope I have not overwhelmed you. You didn't have to take furious notes because you'll go home with them and you've got that blog to refer to. I'm only an email away. Start small, just little small bites. And even an individual study doesn't have to be giant. You've got a lot of tools at your fingertips, including this nice little evaluation for today's meeting. So with that, I thank you with a race through evaluation 10.